You think you know what torture looks like. You've seen the movies, read the books, imagined the medieval dungeons with their iron maidens and rack machines. But tonight, while you sit comfortable in your ignorance, I'm going to show you what really happened in the amphitheaters of Rome, and when I'm done, you'll never look at modern sports the same way again. See, we've been sold a lie, a beautiful golden lie wrapped in Hollywood glamour and historical romanticism. The Gladiator, that noble warrior fighting for freedom, for honor, for the roar of the crowd, Russell Crowe with his perfect abs and righteous anger. But here's what they don't tell you in those epic films. Being a gladiator wasn't about heroism, it was about being livestock. Human cattle bred, trained, and slaughtered for entertainment. And the most terrifying part? It wasn't quick. It wasn't merciful. It was a slow, methodical destruction of everything that made you human, stretched across years of systematic brutality that would make medieval torturers weep with envy. You want to know the difference between a medieval torture chamber and a gladiator school? The medieval torturer wanted information, confession, or punishment. He had a goal. The gladiator master wanted something far more insidious. He wanted to break you so completely that you'd beg for the privilege of dying for other people's amusement. Let me paint you a picture of what your life would really be like. You wake up, if you can call it waking up, in a cell smaller than your bathroom. The walls are stone, cold, and damp, and they smell like fear. Not metaphorically, literally. Decades of human terror have soaked into those rocks, creating a stench that burns your nostrils and never leaves your clothes. Your cellmate, he's been here 3 years. You can tell because he's stopped talking to the rats. At first, new gladiators befriend the vermin. Anything for companionship in this hell. But after a while, even the rats start to look like potential threats. Competition for the scraps of moldy bread that constitute your daily meal. The food situation alone would break most people. Medieval prisoners, even in the darkest dungeons, were fed to keep them alive for questioning. But gladiators? You're fed just enough to maintain muscle mass for the show. No more, no less. Your diet is calculated with the precision of a modern athlete's regimen, except instead of optimizing performance, it's optimizing your ability to die spectacularly. Barley porridge, that's it. Sometimes with beans if you're lucky. They called it hordeari, no, not barley men. Not because barley was cheap, but because it created a very specific type of muscle fiber. Soft enough to cut through dramatically, dense enough to spray blood in impressive arcs when severed. You are literally being marinated from the inside out. But the physical preparation is nothing compared to the psychological conditioning. This is where the Romans showed their true genius for cruelty. They didn't just want to kill you, they wanted to transform you into something that would kill others willingly, even eagerly. Your trainer isn't just teaching you to fight, he's teaching you to stop being human. Every instinct for self-preservation, every natural reluctance to harm another person, every shred of empathy, it all has to be systematically destroyed. And they had centuries to perfect this process. The training begins before dawn. You're awakened by guards who seem to enjoy their work a little too much. Your first lesson isn't about swords or shields, it's about pain management. They beat you. Not randomly, not in anger, but with scientific precision, teaching your body to function while damaged, to ignore signals that would normally make you stop fighting. Medieval torture broke men to extract confessions. Gladiator training broke men to make them ignore their own breaking. Can you imagine the psychological impact of being systematically taught that your pain doesn't matter? That your body is just meat to be carved up for entertainment? The weapons training comes next, and here's where the true horror reveals itself. You're not learning to fight efficiently. You're learning to fight beautifully. Every move is choreographed for maximum visual impact. That sword thrust isn't designed to kill quickly. It's designed to create a fountain of blood that will sparkle in the afternoon sun. Your instructor demonstrates on prisoners, live ones, men and women who've committed minor crimes, now serving as practice dummies for your education. You watch a human being reduced to a teaching tool, their screams becoming background noise to your lesson on proper blade angle for maximum arterial spray. And slowly, horribly, you begin to understand you're not being trained to be a warrior. You're being trained to be a performer in the most depraved theater ever conceived. Your life, your death, your pain, it's all just stagecraft for the entertainment of people who will never know your name. The veterans, those who've survived more than a few fights, they have a look in their eyes. It's not the 1,000-yard stare of shell-shocked soldiers. It's something worse. It's the look of someone who's accepted that they're not really human anymore. They've become something else entirely, a hybrid of man and entertainment device. They whisper stories in the darkness, tales of fighters who tried to refuse, who attempted to maintain their humanity. The punishments for such defiance make medieval torture look like a spa treatment. Crucifixion was merciful compared to what happened to gladiators who wouldn't perform. But here's the most insidious part. Eventually, you stop wanting to refuse. The conditioning works. Your mind, desperate to make sense of this nightmare, begins to find pride in your performance. You start to crave the roar of the crowd, the moment when your blade finds its mark. You become addicted to the very thing that's destroying you. Medieval torture breaks your body to reach your mind. Gladiator training breaks your mind to control your body. And once that mind is broken, reshaped, and rebuilt in the image of entertainment, You become something far more terrifying than any medieval torture device. You become willing. The crowd doesn't just want to see you die. They want to see you want to die well. They want to witness the complete transformation of a human being into a willing sacrifice for their amusement. And the most horrifying part? By the time you step into that arena, you'll give them exactly what they want. But this story, it didn't end with the fall of Rome. The next time you watch a contact sport, cheer for a fighter, or pay to see someone get hurt for entertainment, remember what I've told you tonight. Remember how little separates the crowd in the Colosseum from the crowd in any modern arena. And ask yourself, if you had been born in Rome, would you have been in the sand? Or in the stands? You think that first taste of horror was the worst of it? That psychological conditioning was the deepest level of this nightmare? You're wrong. Dead wrong. Because what I just described, that systematic destruction of human identity, that was just the appetizer. The real feast of terror begins when you understand how they kept you alive just long enough to perfect your destruction. See, medieval torture had one fatal flaw from an entertainment perspective. It ended too quickly. A man on the rack would break in hours. The Iron Maiden would kill in minutes. But the Romans? They discovered something far more sinister. They learned how to stretch the dying process across months, even years, while keeping you functional enough to perform. Welcome to the medical nightmare that was gladiator maintenance. You thought modern sports medicine was ruthless? The Romans invented a form of healthcare designed not to heal you, but to keep you alive, just long enough to die spectacularly in public. Every treatment, every intervention, every moment of relief was calculated to maximize your entertainment value. The gladiator schools had their own medical staff, trained physicians who had taken everything noble about healing and twisted it into something monstrous. These weren't battlefield medics trying to save lives. They were technicians maintaining expensive equipment. And you were the equipment. Picture this. You've just survived your first fight. Barely. There's a gash across your chest that's bleeding freely, and your left arm hangs useless at your side. In any other context, you'd be rushed to healers, given the best care possible. But in the gladiator school, the physician takes one look at you and makes calculations that would freeze your blood. That chest wound? It's not life-threatening, but it's impressive. It'll scar beautifully, giving you that weathered veteran look the crowd loves. So instead of proper sutures, you get rough stitching designed to heal poorly. The scar tissue will be thick, raised, and dramatic, perfect for catching the light during your next performance. Your arm? It's dislocated, not broken. Fixable. But a gladiator with a slightly limited range of motion fights differently, more desperately. It adds vulnerability that the audience finds exciting. So they reset it, just poorly enough to ensure you'll never regain full strength. Every future fight will be slightly harder, slightly more dangerous, more entertaining. The pain management is where their genius for cruelty really shines. They give you just enough opium to prevent you from going into shock, but not enough to dull the edge of agony. They want you functional, not comfortable. The constant pain serves multiple purposes. It keeps you aggressive, makes you desperate, and ensures you'll fight with the kind of frantic energy that gets crowds on their feet. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. They keep detailed records. Charts tracking your injuries, your healing times, your performance levels at different stages of recovery. They're not just maintaining you. They're conducting medical experiments using your body as the laboratory. Dr. Galen, the most famous physician in Rome, built his entire career on knowledge gained from gladiator schools. Every breakthrough in anatomy, every understanding of muscle function, every insight into how the human body responds to trauma, it all came from systematic observation of gladiator injuries. You weren't just entertainment, you were unwilling test subjects in humanity's darkest medical research. The dietary control becomes even more sinister when you understand its true purpose. That barley porridge I mentioned, it wasn't just about creating the right muscle consistency. It was about maintaining a very specific nutritional deficiency. Protein levels calculated to keep you strong enough to fight, but weak enough to be controllable. Vitamin deficiencies that would make you slightly anemic, ensuring that even minor wounds would bleed impressively. They discovered that gladiators on iron-deficient diets put on better shows. The slight weakness made fights last longer. The reduced clotting factors made wounds more dramatic, and the mild cognitive impairment made you more reckless. Every meal was a carefully calculated dose of controlled malnutrition. The psychological manipulation reaches new depths when you realize how they used your own healing process against you. Recovery time wasn't rest, it was extended psychological torture. Lying in that cell, unable to move without pain, you had endless hours to contemplate your next fight, to imagine all the ways you might die, to feel your body slowly, inadequately healing itself just enough to be destroyed again. They would bring other fighters to visit you during recovery, not for companionship, but for psychological conditioning. Veterans would describe their most brutal fights in vivid detail. Newcomers would be forced to watch as healers worked on your wounds, learning exactly what awaited them. Your suffering became a teaching tool for the next generation of victims. The equipment maintenance was just as calculated. Your weapons weren't just tools, they were extensions of your managed deterioration. Swords slightly duller than they should be, ensuring fights lasted longer. Shields with imperceptible weaknesses that would fail at dramatically appropriate moments. Armor designed to protect vital organs while leaving plenty of surface area for spectacular but non-fatal wounds. Even your training weapons were part of the system. Wooden swords heavier than real ones, building muscle mass in all the wrong places. Practice shields that developed fighting techniques guaranteed to leave you exposed in actual combat. Everything was designed to make you strong enough to put on a show, but flawed enough to ensure you wouldn't survive too many performances. The veterans who somehow managed to survive multiple fights faced a horror that medieval torture never conceived. They lived long enough to understand the system completely. They could see exactly how they were being manipulated, managed, and slowly destroyed. But by then, the psychological conditioning was so complete that they couldn't stop participating. These survivors became living ghosts, caught between human consciousness and gladiator programming. They would help train new fighters, passing on the very techniques that would ensure the newcomer's destruction. They became complicit in their own nightmare, unable to break free from a system that had rewired their most basic survival instincts. The medical examinations before each fight were perhaps the most dehumanizing aspect of all. Physicians would inspect you like livestock, checking muscle tone, reflexes, and injury status. But they weren't trying to determine if you were healthy enough to fight safely. They were calculating your entertainment value and probable survival time. Too healthy? You might win too easily, boring the crowd. Too injured? You might die too quickly, cutting the show short. The goal was to find that perfect balance of damage and function that would produce maximum spectacle. You were being fine-tuned like a musical instrument, except the music was your own suffering. The truly broken ones, the gladiators who had survived long enough to become crowd favorites, faced the ultimate horror. They were too valuable to be allowed to die naturally, so they were maintained, kept functional through increasingly desperate medical interventions, forced to fight long past the point where their bodies could reasonably continue. Picture a man whose bones have been broken and reset so many times that he moves like a marionette, whose scars have scars, whose mind has been shattered and rebuilt around the single purpose of dying well for other people's entertainment. He's not human anymore. He's a walking testament to humanity's capacity for creative cruelty. But this medical nightmare, this systematic destruction of human bodies for entertainment, it didn't die with the gladiators. The next time you watch a fighter push to continue despite obvious injury, remember what I've told you. Remember how easily we slip back into treating human beings as equipment to be maintained until they break. And wonder, in our modern arenas, who are the physicians and who are the gladiators? You think you've seen the depths of this nightmare? The systematic destruction of body and mind? The perversion of medicine into an instrument of prolonged torture? You haven't even scratched the surface. Because what I'm about to tell you will make everything else seem like a gentle introduction to the real horror. The gladiator fights you've imagined. Those dramatic one-on-one duels, the noble combat, the clean death with honor. None of that existed. It was all theater. Carefully choreographed theater designed to extract maximum suffering from minimum death. And the audience, they weren't just watching violence. They were participating in something far more sinister. Welcome to the true heart of the arena. The psychology of mass sadism. The Romans didn't just create a system for killing gladiators. They created a system for transforming ordinary citizens into willing participants in industrial-scale torture. Every person in those stands was being systematically conditioned to find human suffering not just acceptable, but entertaining. The games weren't random bloodbaths. They were carefully structured psychological experiments conducted on a massive scale. Each event was designed to push the boundaries of what the audience would accept, gradually normalizing levels of cruelty that would have horrified them in any other context. The gladiator was just the catalyst. The real experiment was being conducted on the 50,000 spectators. Start with the morning warm-up acts. Before the famous gladiator fights, they would parade out the damnati ad bestias, criminals condemned to the beasts. These weren't executions in any traditional sense. They were elaborate torture sessions designed to prepare the crowd's appetite for greater atrocities. Picture this. A man convicted of theft is pushed into the arena. He's unarmed, of course, facing a lion that's been deliberately starved for days. But here's the twist. The lion isn't just hungry. It's been trained. Yes, trained. The Romans developed techniques for conditioning wild animals to kill in specific ways, to prolong the death, to create maximum spectacle. The crowd starts the day watching a human being torn apart by a beast that's been turned into a torture device. And they cheer. They place bets on how long it will take, which body part will be consumed first, whether the victim will scream or maintain dignity. They're being systematically desensitized to human suffering, one horrific death at a time. But that's just the appetizer. The main course involves a level of psychological manipulation that would make modern propagandists weep with envy. The gladiator fights weren't just combat. They were narrative experiences designed to make the audience complicit in the killing. Each gladiator had a persona, a backstory, a character arc. The crowd was encouraged to develop emotional attachments to these fighters. They had favorite gladiators. They followed their careers. They invested emotionally in their success. And then, when the moment came, they were given the power to decide whether their favorite lived or died. The thumbs up, thumbs down, that wasn't just audience participation. It was a carefully designed psychological trap. By giving the crowd the illusion of control over life and death, the Romans made them active participants in murder. Every spectator became a killer, their conscience salved by the fiction that they were merely expressing preference, not ordering execution. The gladiators themselves were coached in how to die appealingly. There were schools of death, techniques for making your final moments entertaining, the way you fell, the sounds you made, the expression on your face as life left your body. All of it was choreographed to maximize the emotional impact on the audience. A gladiator who died badly, too quickly, too quietly, without sufficient drama, would be remembered as a failure. Their death would be considered a waste of the crowd's investment. So they were trained to die slowly, painfully, but with a performance that would satisfy the bloodlust of 50,000 spectators. The crowd's psychology was manipulated through carefully controlled pacing. Early fights would be relatively mild, building tension, then increasingly brutal encounters, each one pushing the audience further past their normal moral boundaries. By the time the main events began, the spectators had been conditioned to accept levels of violence that would have disgusted them hours earlier. The social dynamics were just as calculated. The seating arrangement wasn't random. It was designed to create peer pressure for bloodthirstiness. The most sadistic spectators were placed strategically to influence those around them. Cheering for mercy became socially unacceptable. Demanding greater violence became a mark of sophistication. Women and children attended these events regularly, not despite the horror, but because of it. The Romans understood that exposing entire families to systematic cruelty would normalize violence across all levels of society. Children grew up believing that human suffering was entertainment, that life and death were games to be played for amusement. The betting system added another layer of psychological manipulation. Spectators weren't just watching gladiators fight, they were financially invested in specific outcomes. A man who had wagered on a particular gladiator's death would scream for blood with the fervor of someone whose money depended on murder. The crowd became a financial market trading in human lives. The rituals surrounding death were designed to make killing sacred. When a gladiator died, there were ceremonies, religious observances, formal procedures for disposing of the body. The crowd participated in these rituals, making them feel that the death they had witnessed and ordered was somehow holy, justified, necessary. But here's where the true genius of Roman psychological manipulation reveals itself. They made the audience believe they were civilized, that their bloodlust was refined, sophisticated, different from crude barbarian violence. They created an elaborate mythology around gladiator combat that framed systematic torture as noble sport. The gladiators were described as heroes, volunteers, noble warriors choosing honor over safety. The crowd was told they were witnessing displays of courage, skill, and Roman virtue. Every aspect of the systematic dehumanization was wrapped in language that made the spectators feel elevated, cultured, morally superior. The psychological conditioning extended beyond the arena. Citizens who had cheered for death in the afternoon would return home to their families. Their perception of violence fundamentally altered. They had been trained to see human suffering as entertainment, and that training didn't disappear when they left the amphitheater. The veterans of these spectacles, the regular attendees who had witnessed hundreds of deaths, developed a particular kind of psychological damage. They became connoisseurs of suffering, able to distinguish between different types of agony the way wine enthusiasts discuss vintage characteristics. They had been transformed into something that was still technically human, but functionally monstrous. The children were perhaps the most tragic victims of this psychological warfare. Growing up in a culture where public torture was family entertainment, they never developed normal human responses to suffering. They were being systematically programmed to accept cruelty as natural, necessary, even beautiful. The social pressure to attend these events was enormous. Missing the games marked you as soft, unpatriotic, possibly subversive. The amphitheater became a test of citizenship, where your willingness to participate in mass sadism proved your loyalty to Rome. Mercy became treason. Compassion became weakness. The most successful gladiators, the ones who survived multiple fights and became crowd favorites, faced a horror that medieval torture never conceived. They were forced to become entertainers in their own destruction, to smile and wave at the very people who would eventually order their deaths. They had to cultivate relationships with an audience that saw them as expendable entertainment. But this psychological conditioning, this systematic transformation of ordinary people into willing participants in industrial cruelty, it didn't end with the fall of Rome. The mechanisms they developed for making mass sadism socially acceptable are still with us, refined and perfected by centuries of practice. The next time you find yourself cheering for someone to get hurt, enjoying another person's pain, or betting on violent outcomes, remember what I've told you. Remember how easily an entire civilization convinced itself that torture was entertainment, that cruelty was culture, that murder was sport. And ask yourself, what are you really watching when you watch people fight? What are you really becoming when you cheer for blood? You think that psychological manipulation was the final layer of this nightmare? That turning an entire civilization into willing participants in mass torture was the ultimate expression of Roman cruelty? You're still thinking too small. Because what I'm about to reveal will show you that everything, every broken bone, every shattered mind, every corrupted soul, was just infrastructure for something far more terrifying. The gladiator system wasn't just about entertainment. It wasn't even just about control. It was about something that would make medieval torturers abandon their craft in horror. The Romans had discovered how to weaponize human suffering itself, turning pain into a form of social currency that could buy political power, religious absolution, and cultural immortality. Welcome to the true purpose of the arena, a machine for converting human agony into divine favor. The Romans believed with absolute certainty that the gods demanded blood, not just any blood, but blood extracted through maximum suffering, witnessed by maximum crowds, offered with maximum ceremony. Every gladiator death was a human sacrifice disguised as entertainment. The religious implications were staggering. The games weren't secular events. They were the most important religious ceremonies in the Roman calendar. Every drop of blood spilled in the arena was an offering to the gods. Every scream of pain a prayer, every death a sacrament. The spectators weren't just watching entertainment. They were participating in the most sacred rituals of their civilization. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. The Romans had developed a theology of suffering that made torture not just acceptable, but holy. They believed that the more a person suffered before death, the more valuable their sacrifice became to the gods. A quick, merciful death was worthless. A slow, agonizing death was priceless. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was sophisticated theology developed by educated priests and philosophers. They had created elaborate justifications for why maximum suffering produced maximum divine benefit. The gladiator schools weren't just training fighters. They were preparing sacred offerings, human beings whose pain would be transformed into divine currency. The timing of the games was carefully calculated around a religious festival. The most important gladiator fights coincided with moments when the gods were believed to be most attentive to human offerings. The Spring Games celebrated renewal through death. The Harvest Games thanked the gods for abundance through blood. The Winter Games begged for survival through sacrifice. Every aspect of gladiator training was infused with religious significance. The weapons weren't just tools, they were sacred instruments blessed by priests. The armor wasn't just protection, it was ceremonial garb designed to present the sacrifice properly to the gods. The fighting techniques weren't just combat skills, they were ritualized methods for extracting maximum suffering from the human offering. The gladiators themselves were transformed into unwilling priests of their own destruction. They were taught prayers to recite as they fought, specific words to speak as they died, gestures to make as life left their bodies. Every gladiator death was a religious performance, conducted according to strict theological requirements. The medical system I described earlier becomes even more sinister when you understand its religious purpose. Those physicians weren't just maintaining equipment, they were preparing sacred offerings. Every intervention was calculated not just for entertainment value, but for spiritual significance. The gods demanded their sacrifices to be perfect, healthy enough to suffer properly, damaged enough to die dramatically. The crowd's participation wasn't just bloodlust, it was communal worship. Their cheers were prayers, their decisions about life and death were theological judgments. They believed they were channeling divine will through their thumbs up or thumbs down. Every spectator was a temporary priest, every choice a sacred verdict. The arena itself was designed as a temple. The architecture, the decorations, the layout, everything was calculated to create a sacred space where human sacrifice could be offered to the gods with maximum efficiency. The sand that soaked up gladiator blood was consecrated ground, more holy than any church altar. The betting system becomes even more disturbing when you understand its religious context. Romans weren't just gambling on fights, they were making financial offerings to the gods. Winning a bet meant the gods had accepted your sacrifice and rewarded your faith. Losing meant you hadn't offered enough suffering to deserve divine favor. The social pressure to attend wasn't just about citizenship, it was about salvation. Missing the games wasn't just unpatriotic, it was blasphemous. Romans believed that witnessing human sacrifice was a religious duty, that their presence at the games was necessary for the gods to accept the offering. Every empty seat was a spiritual failure. The children brought to these events weren't just being desensitized to violence, they were being initiated into the most important religious mysteries of their culture. They were learning that human suffering was sacred, that pain was prayer, that death was divine communication. They were being trained to see torture as worship. The gladiator schools had their own priests, religious officials, whose job was to ensure that every aspect of training served the gods' requirements. These priests would examine gladiators before fights, not just for physical readiness, but for spiritual purity. They would perform ceremonies to consecrate the weapons, bless the armor, and prepare the sacrifice for divine consumption. The death rituals were the most elaborate part of the religious ceremony. When a gladiator died, priests would collect the blood for use in other ceremonies. The body would be processed according to strict religious protocols. The weapons would be consecrated through contact with sacred blood. The very sand of the arena would be blessed by the sacrifice. The successful gladiators, those who survived multiple fights, faced a religious horror that medieval torture never conceived. They were living saints of suffering, their continued existence proof that the gods found their pain particularly pleasing. They were kept alive not just for entertainment, but because their prolonged agony was considered the most valuable offering possible. The Romans developed complex theological calculations for determining the spiritual value of different types of gladiator deaths. A quick death by sword was worth less than a slow death by wild beast. A death by a skilled opponent was worth less than a death by a clumsy novice. A death accepted with dignity was worth less than a death accompanied by maximum screaming. The arena physicians kept detailed records, not just of medical treatments, but of spiritual significance. They would note which injuries produced the most pleasing sounds, which wounds created the most dramatic visual effects, which types of damage resulted in the most satisfying death performances. They were conducting religious research using human suffering as their primary data. The psychological conditioning of the audience served a religious purpose. They were being trained to recognize and appreciate the spiritual value of human pain. A crowd that could distinguish between different types of agony was a crowd that could properly value the sacrifice being offered to the gods. They were being educated in the theology of suffering. The veterans who attended hundreds of games weren't just bloodthirsty, they were devoutly religious. They had devoted their lives to witnessing human sacrifice, becoming connoisseurs of spiritual suffering. They could evaluate the religious significance of a gladiator's death the way modern clergy might evaluate a prayer or sermon. The most disturbing aspect of this religious system was its self-reinforcing nature. The more suffering the Romans offered to their gods, the more they believed their gods demanded. Each spectacular death created a spiritual debt that could only be repaid with an even more spectacular death. The system required constant escalation of cruelty to maintain divine favor. The political implications were staggering. Emperors who provided the most elaborate games, the most creative tortures, the most satisfying deaths were considered the most pious rulers. Political success was measured by your ability to offer the gods sufficient human suffering. The arena became a theological competition where politicians competed to provide the most pleasing sacrifice. But this religious system, this transformation of torture into worship, this elevation of human suffering to divine sacrament, it didn't disappear with the fall of Rome. The mechanisms they developed for making cruelty sacred, for turning pain into prayer, for transforming murder into religious duty, these mechanisms survived, evolved, and found new expressions in every civilization that followed. The next time you see violence justified by higher purpose, suffering explained as necessary sacrifice, cruelty defended as divine will, remember what I've told you. Remember how easily an entire civilization convinced itself that torture was worship, that pain was prayer, that murder was sacrament. And wonder, when you witness suffering today, what gods do you think you're serving? You think that religious horror was the final revelation? That turning torture into worship was the ultimate expression of human depravity? You're still not seeing the complete picture. Because what I'm about to show you will reveal that everything, every broken body, every shattered mind, every corrupted soul, every sacred justification, was just the foundation for something so monumentally evil that it would make the devil himself take notes. The gladiator system wasn't just about individual suffering. It wasn't even just about mass psychological conditioning or religious sacrifice. It was about something far more ambitious and infinitely more terrifying. The Romans had discovered how to use human torture as a technology for reshaping reality itself. They had learned to weaponize suffering on a scale that could alter the fundamental nature of civilization. Welcome to the true masterpiece of Roman engineering, a machine for converting human agony into imperial power. Every scream in the arena was a vote for tyranny. Every death was a brick in the foundation of absolute control. Every drop of blood was fuel for a system that would spread across continents and persist for centuries. The genius of it was breathtaking in its scope. The Romans had realized that a population conditioned to enjoy watching torture would never rebel against being tortured themselves. Citizens who cheered for gladiator deaths were being programmed to accept their own powerlessness. The arena wasn't just entertainment, it was the most sophisticated system of political control ever devised. Think about the psychological mathematics involved. 50,000 people in the Colosseum, all experiencing the same emotional conditioning simultaneously, all learning the same lessons about the value of human life, the acceptability of suffering, the entertainment value of death, all being systematically trained to see cruelty as normal, necessary, even beautiful. Now multiply that by every amphitheater across the Roman Empire. Hundreds of venues, thousands of events, millions of spectators, all being processed through the same psychological machinery. An entire civilization being reprogrammed to accept brutality as the natural order of things. The scale of mental manipulation was unprecedented in human history. The political implications were staggering. Emperors didn't just provide games to keep the population entertained, they provided them to demonstrate the absolute power of the state over human life. Every gladiator death was a reminder that the government could kill anyone, anytime, for any reason. The arena was a classroom where citizens learned their place in the imperial hierarchy. The message was clear and constant. Resist the state, and you might find yourself in the sand. Speak against the emperor, and you might face the lions. Challenge the system, and you might discover what it feels like to die for other people's amusement. The Gladiator games were a perpetual threat disguised as entertainment, but the control mechanism was even more sophisticated than simple intimidation. The Romans had discovered that people who participate in violence become psychologically invested in the system that provides it. Every spectator who cheered for death became a stakeholder in the imperial machine. They couldn't oppose a system they had helped to operate. The betting system wasn't just about money, it was about complicity. Romans who wagered on gladiator fights were literally investing in the continuation of the system. They had a financial stake in seeing more people die. They couldn't advocate for reform without advocating for their own financial loss. The social pressure to attend wasn't just about citizenship, it was about surveillance. The arena was a place where the state could observe the loyalty of its subjects. Your reactions to the violence were being monitored, evaluated, recorded. Citizens who seemed too sympathetic to the gladiators, too disturbed by the deaths, too reluctant to participate in the bloodlust, they were marked as potential dissidents. The religious justifications served a dual purpose. They didn't just make the torture sacred, they made opposition to torture blasphemous. Romans who questioned the games weren't just being unpatriotic, they were being ungodly. The state had weaponized divine authority to protect its torture system from moral criticism. The gladiator schools weren't just training facilities, they were laboratories for developing new forms of social control. The techniques used to break gladiators psychologically were being refined and adapted for use on the general population. The Romans were learning how to manufacture consent for their own oppression. The medical system wasn't just about maintaining gladiators. It was about perfecting the science of controlled suffering. The physicians were developing techniques for inflicting maximum pain without causing immediate death. Methods that could be applied to political prisoners, religious dissidents, and anyone else who threatened imperial power. The children brought to the games weren't just being desensitized to violence. They were being prepared for lives of absolute submission. They were learning that authority figures had the right to inflict suffering, that resistance was futile, that their only choice was to participate in the system or become its victims. The arena architecture itself was a statement about imperial power. The massive structures, the elaborate decorations, the engineering marvels, all of it was designed to demonstrate the state's ability to mobilize unlimited resources for the purpose of human destruction. The message was clear: if we can build this to kill people for fun, imagine what we can do to you if you oppose us. The logistics of the games revealed the true scope of the system: the capture and transport of wild animals, the procurement and training of gladiators, the construction and maintenance of amphitheaters, the organization of events. It all required a massive bureaucracy dedicated to the industrial production of human suffering. Think about the economic implications. Entire industries built around the gladiator system: slave traders, animal dealers, weapon manufacturers, medical suppliers, construction companies. Thousands of jobs dependent on the continuation of systematic torture. Economic interests aligned with political control to create a system that was virtually impossible to dismantle. The Roman military wasn't just conquering territories, it was harvesting human raw materials for the arena. Every successful campaign provided new gladiators, new exotic animals, new forms of entertainment. Conquest became a form of shopping for torture supplies. The legal system was integrated into the gladiator machine. Courts weren't just dispensing justice, they were feeding the arena. The death penalty wasn't just punishment, it was content production. The entire concept of justice was corrupted by the need to provide entertainment through suffering. The educational system was designed to produce citizens who would accept and support the gladiator games. Children were taught that Roman superiority was demonstrated through their ability to organize spectacular violence. They were trained to see cruelty as a mark of civilization, torture as a sign of cultural advancement. The propaganda machine was equally sophisticated. Roman writers, artists, and philosophers worked to create a mythology around the games that made them seem noble, necessary, and inevitable. They developed elaborate justifications for why systematic torture was actually beneficial for society. The international implications were equally sinister. The Romans used the games to demonstrate their power to foreign dignitaries, to intimidate potential enemies, to showcase the futility of resistance. The arena became a diplomatic tool, a way of communicating imperial strength through the language of human suffering. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the system was its self-perpetuating nature. Each generation of Romans was more conditioned to accept violence than the last. Each new emperor had to provide more elaborate games than his predecessor. The system required constant escalation, constant innovation in cruelty, constant expansion of suffering. The gladiator system had become a living organism, feeding on human pain and growing stronger with each meal. It had developed its own momentum, its own logic, its own irresistible drive for expansion. The Romans had created a monster that would eventually consume them along with everyone else. The collapse of the Roman Empire wasn't just political or economic, it was moral. A civilization that had built its foundation on systematic torture had poisoned itself from within. The gladiator system had taught Romans to see their fellow humans as expendable entertainment, and eventually they began to see each other the same way. But this system, this technology for converting human suffering into political power, this machine for manufacturing consent through torture, it didn't die with Rome. The mechanisms they developed for using cruelty as a form of social control have been refined, adapted, and perfected by every authoritarian system that followed. The next time you see a government justify violence as necessary for security, a system that demands suffering as proof of strength, a culture that celebrates cruelty as entertainment, remember what I've told you. Remember how easily an entire civilization convinced itself that torture was governance, that suffering was strength, that cruelty was civilization. And ask yourself, what empire is being built on the suffering you're watching today? You think that political control was the final layer of this nightmare? That using torture as a technology for imperial power was the ultimate expression of human evil? You're still not seeing the complete horror. Because what I'm about to reveal will show you that everything, every broken body, every shattered mind, every corrupted soul, every sacred justification, every political manipulation, was just preparation for something so fundamentally destructive that it would rewrite the very definition of what it means to be human. The Gladiator system wasn't just about individual suffering, mass conditioning, religious sacrifice, or political control. It was about something far more ambitious and infinitely more terrifying. The Romans had discovered how to use systematic torture to fundamentally alter human evolution itself. They had learned to weaponize suffering on a scale that could change the biological destiny of our species. Welcome to the final revelation. A machine for converting human agony into evolutionary pressure. Every death in the arena was a step toward creating a new kind of human being. Every act of cruelty was selective breeding for traits that would serve the empire. Every generation of spectators was being genetically programmed to accept and perpetuate systematic violence. The genius of it was evolutionary in scope. The Romans had realized that humans who could watch torture without flinching, who could participate in mass murder without guilt, who could find entertainment in suffering, these humans would be more successful in Roman society. They would have more children, pass on their genes, and gradually become the dominant strain of humanity. Think about the biological mathematics involved. Across the Roman Empire, for over 4 centuries, the humans most likely to survive and reproduce were those who could adapt to a culture of systematic cruelty. Romans who were too empathetic, too compassionate, too disturbed by violence. They were socially ostracized, economically disadvantaged, and evolutionarily selected against. The arena wasn't just entertainment, it was a breeding program, a massive, multi-generational experiment in human genetic modification conducted through environmental pressure. The Romans were using torture as a tool for directed evolution, creating a subspecies of humans specifically adapted to thrive in conditions of systematic brutality. The gladiator schools weren't just training facilities, they were laboratories for identifying and cultivating the specific human traits that the empire needed. The men who could endure maximum suffering, who could inflict maximum pain, who could perform maximum violence. These were the genetic templates being preserved and propagated. The medical system wasn't just about maintaining gladiators. It was about studying human pain tolerance, identifying the biological mechanisms of suffering, and developing techniques for pushing the human body beyond its natural limitations. The physicians were conducting evolutionary research using live human subjects. The psychological conditioning wasn't just about controlling individual minds. It was about rewiring the human brain on a species level. Romans who attended the games regularly were developing neurological adaptations that made them more comfortable with violence, more capable of inflicting suffering, more suited to life in a torture-based civilization. The children brought to the games weren't just being desensitized. They were being subjected to developmental pressures that would alter their brain structure permanently. Their neural pathways were being shaped by exposure to systematic violence, creating cognitive patterns that would be passed on to their own children. The religious justifications weren't just about making torture sacred. They were about creating evolutionary pressure for humans who could reconcile extreme cruelty with spiritual belief. Romans who could worship gods through human sacrifice were developing psychological traits that would make them more successful in the imperial system. The political implications were evolutionary. The Romans weren't just creating a system of government, they were creating a species of humans specifically adapted to be governed through fear and violence. Citizens who could accept systematic torture as normal governance were developing the genetic traits necessary for life under permanent tyranny. The economic system wasn't just about profiting from suffering, it was about creating evolutionary pressure for humans who could build their prosperity on other people's pain. Romans who could accumulate wealth through the torture industry were developing the psychological and genetic traits necessary for success in a cruelty-based economy. The social pressure wasn't just about conformity, it was about creating evolutionary advantage for humans who could participate in mass sadism without psychological damage. Romans who could enjoy watching torture were more likely to succeed socially, economically, and reproductively. The legal system wasn't just about dispensing justice, it was about creating evolutionary pressure for humans who could accept systematic cruelty as legitimate authority. Romans who could support a legal system that fed people to wild animals were developing the traits necessary for life under permanent brutality. The military wasn't just about conquest, It was about harvesting genetic material from conquered populations and subjecting it to evolutionary pressure through the gladiator system. The Romans were conducting biological warfare on a species level, using torture to reshape human evolution itself. The educational system wasn't just about training citizens. It was about creating evolutionary pressure for humans who could teach systematic cruelty as civilization. Romans who could educate their children to accept torture as entertainment were developing the traits necessary for perpetuating a brutality-based culture across generations. The propaganda machine wasn't just about controlling information. It was about creating evolutionary pressure for humans who could rationalize systematic torture as cultural advancement. Romans who could create art, literature, and philosophy that celebrated cruelty were developing the cognitive traits necessary for intellectual leadership in a torture-based society. The international implications were evolutionary. The Romans weren't just conquering territories, they were spreading their genetically modified strain of humanity across the known world. Every population that was Romanized was being subjected to evolutionary pressure that would make them more compatible with systematic brutality. The arena architecture wasn't just about demonstrating power, it was about creating environmental pressure that would favor humans adapted to life in a torture-based civilization. The massive amphitheaters were evolutionary laboratories, where entire populations were being subjected to systematic genetic modification through environmental conditioning. The logistics of the games weren't just about organization, they were about creating evolutionary pressure for humans who could build complex systems around the production of suffering. Romans who could coordinate massive torture operations were developing the traits necessary for leadership in a cruelty-based civilization. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this evolutionary experiment was its success. The Romans had actually begun to create a new subspecies of human, one that was biologically adapted to thrive in conditions of systematic torture. These humans had reduced empathy, increased pain tolerance, enhanced capacity for violence, and improved ability to rationalize cruelty. The collapse of the Roman Empire wasn't just political, it was biological. The strain of humanity they had created was so adapted to life under systematic brutality that it couldn't survive in more normal conditions. When the torture system collapsed, the humans who had been genetically modified to serve it began to die out. But the genetic modifications didn't disappear completely. The Roman strain of humanity had spread too far, influenced too many populations, created too many genetic changes to be completely eliminated. The traits they had bred for, reduced empathy, increased tolerance for violence, enhanced capacity for cruelty, these traits survived in the human gene pool. Every subsequent civilization that embraced systematic torture was drawing on this genetic legacy. Every population that could accept cruelty as entertainment was expressing traits that the Romans had bred into the human species. Every culture that could rationalize suffering as necessary was manifesting the evolutionary changes that the gladiator system had created. The modern world isn't just influenced by Roman culture, it's populated by humans, who are partially descended from the Romans' evolutionary experiment. The capacity for systematic cruelty that we see in contemporary societies isn't just learned behavior. It's genetic inheritance from a species-wide torture program that lasted for centuries. The next time you see humans capable of watching suffering without flinching, participating in systematic cruelty without guilt, rationalizing torture as necessary, remember what I've told you. Remember that these aren't just cultural adaptations. They're genetic modifications created by the most ambitious biological warfare program in human history. The gladiator system didn't just change Roman society, it changed human nature itself. And those changes are still with us, still influencing us, still shaping our capacity for both cruelty and compassion. The Romans didn't just build an empire, they built a new species. And we are their children, carrying their genetic legacy, living with their modifications, struggling with their evolutionary programming. The question isn't whether we can overcome this legacy, it's whether we can even recognize it. Because the most successful aspect of the Roman evolutionary experiment was making the modified humans believe they were still normal, still natural, still the same species that had existed before the arenas were built, but we're not. We're something else now. Something that was shaped by centuries of systematic torture, bred for compatibility with cruelty, genetically modified to accept suffering as entertainment. And the most terrifying part? We're still evolving. The pressures that the Romans created are still operating. The genetic modifications they began are still continuing. The evolutionary experiment they started is still running. The gladiator system may have ended, but its biological legacy continues. And every time we choose cruelty over compassion, violence over mercy, entertainment over empathy, we're feeding the monster that the Romans created in our genes. The arena may be gone, but the gladiators are still fighting. They're fighting inside us, in our DNA, in our evolutionary programming. And they're winning. The real question isn't what the Romans did to their gladiators. The real question is what they did to us, and whether we can still remember what we were before they changed us forever.